we've had an explanation from John Howard, but you were obviously a very senior person in the Liberal Party in 1996. Why did the Liberal Party go to the election in that year promising a convention?
Well, David, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me here, David. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. And this is a great occasion, 20 years since that wonderful day on the 6th of November. You've got to go back to 94 to see the origins of the proposition that we hold a convention. As you said, I was elected in 93, and then in early 94, I conspired with Alexander Downer and Peter Costello to remove the hapless Hewson from the leadership of the Liberal Party. And thank you. And at that time, Downer then, as leader, appointed me as his shadow parliamentary secretary to try to watch his back and look after him, at which I failed. But the Republican issue was very hot at the time. You might remember in 94, Keating had really whipped that up. He'd had his Turnbull, committee to look at options and all that sort of stuff. So we had to have a position on what we would do if elected in 96 about this issue of the Constitution. And of course, you've got to remember there are a lot of Liberals who, regrettably, were supporters of the Republic. So Downer and I, with Costello, came up with this proposition that what we should propose, if elected at the next election, that is 96, was a constitutional convention, half elected and half appointed. And of course, to Downer's credit, the idea flowed from his history. His grandfather was a key player in the conventions of the 1890s, and there's some historic backbone to the proposition. Then, of course, Alexander's leadership imploded, and we persuaded the Parliamentary Liberal Party to anoint John Howard as leader without any contest. And John found himself in the position of this policy which Downer and I had basically designed, and I think John was a bit grumpy about it and couldn't see why we should go to 96 with such a proposition. We convinced John that, having had it on the record and given the potency of the Republican issue and Paul Keating, that we should stick to that policy and continue with it through to the 96 election. And I think it was a very good holding position for the Liberal Party, and I think it kind of neutered the Republican issue. It never became an issue in the 96 election. And while there may have been people in the party who preferred we didn't commit to doing it, I think it was a very sensible policy, and I'm glad John, when he became leader, stuck with it and that we saw it through. John then, when he became Prime Minister, appointed me as I was his shadow parliamentary secretary too in opposition, then officially his parliamentary secretary, and he gave me two jobs as his parliamentary secretary. One was to reform the Native Title Act, which was a massive undertaking, but on the side, to put into effect the coalition government's policy of holding a constitutional convention, which proved to be just as difficult in many ways as reforming the Native Title Act. But that's the background to the policy.
Now, with the process, I've referred to it as the Howard Minchin process, but you were the architect.
Downer was the principal architect, and I was a strong supporter of it and co-conspirator in designing it and convincing the parliamentary party to adopt it as policy.
So it had 8 electorates, and you had the equivalent proportion as you have between the Senate and the House. You weighted it in favour of the smaller states because it was to be the same as a joint meeting of the Parliament. I suppose you did, that it would be postal and voluntary. And I remember there was enormous fuss over it being voluntary. That touched a lot of people in the Parliament who didn't like that. But when you came to the appointed people, some were obviously ex officio, that is, premiers and so on. 75% of them turned out to be Republicans, but when it came to the appointed ones, the ones in the gift of the Prime Minister, you seemed to choose very eminent Australians, like archbishops and so on, and people who weren't represented, groups that weren't represented, like youth and Indigenous. And we were shocked to find on their voting that of those ones in your gift, or in the Prime Minister's gift, 75% voted for a republic. I remember John saying we didn't do that well. The delegates weren't paid, which I thought was a very proper idea. And I remember suggesting this when we were proposing a convention in relation to Indigenous matters, not just a convention purely for the Indigenous, as it turned out to be, but a general convention for all matters relating to constitutional reform, that they shouldn't be paid. And I remember a Labor member of Parliament objected strongly to that. But that is essentially your design. Do you have any regrets about any aspect of that? For example, the voluntary voting or the postal voting?
I have no regrets at all. It was a big job to design an electoral system for the election of half the delegates, 76. And then, of course, because that's the policy we went with, half elected, half appointed. As a senator for the second smallest state, that of South Australia, I was determined that the election methodology reflect the fact we're a federation and reflect the composition of the parliament as a whole, that is the House and the Senate. So I think it was, on reflection, a very good methodology. I was also a passionate supporter of voluntary voting, and I wish that we had it at federal elections. But I was determined to convince the parliamentary party and the cabinet that in conducting a ballot for the election of delegates to the convention, that it would be outrageous to make it an offence if Australian citizens chose not to vote for Malcolm Turnbull or Lloyd Waddy on the risk of, if they didn't pay the fine, they went to jail. And it was extraordinary to me in handling the bill in the Senate that the Senate was just manic about insisting that it be a compulsory ballot. And in fact, you might recall, the Senate rejected our legislation on 2 occasions, forcing this issue to a quasi-constitutional crisis because of this difference between the houses. And there were Liberals in our ranks who wanted to give way on this, and I was able to convince them and the Prime Minister that we had to hold our nerve. And if the Senate didn't want a convention on that basis, an election for a convention on that basis, okay, we wouldn't proceed. That's it. And then finally, Bob Brown and Brian Harradine did see the error of their ways and agreed to allow the legislation through on the 3rd attempt. But the Labor and the Greens and Democrats all stuck to their guns on this, and they refused to vote for a voluntary ballot to elect delegates to, frankly, a meeting which was going to decide nothing by way of law. It was an extraordinary confrontation that we faced, but I'm very glad we did it that way. The appointment of delegates, the Prime Minister took a particularly keen interest in who was appointed. He committed to having representation from young people, Indigenous Australians, women, those who might otherwise miss out through the election process. We excluded MPs from running in the election, so we therefore had to have representation ex officio of MPs at state and federal level. And regrettably, a lot of the Liberals who were there ex officio were, of course, Republicans. I think virtually all the premiers, maybe 1 or 2 that weren't.
And Court wasn't.
Court,
Richard Court was the only one.
Borbidge there?
Borbidge, you're right. Two.
But, John Olsen in my state was a Republican. And so, my Senate leader, Robert Hill, keen Republican. So, and then, of course, by appointing women, young people, Indigenous, from the seniority of their positions, many of those were also Republicans. But at least it immunised us against any suggestion that we were rigging the convention in any way, given the preponderance of Republicans who were there.
I agree with you. I think it was a very good process. It's a template for a very fair way to administer it, particularly when you add in what you did in relation to the financial grants, to the yes and no cases, which were equal, and the way you appointed the committees. Do you think and I know you have your personal investment in it, but do you think that this is a template which could be used for other proposals for major constitutional change?
The convention process itself?
Yes, and the way you did it, the way you made up the convention, the way you had the election, and the way you granted money to both sides equally.
Well, separating out the referendum campaign itself from the convention. I suppose on constitutional issues, it's horses for courses. In the case of the Constitutional Convention that we held on the question of a republic, we were, as John and I and Tony, particularly as constitutional conservatives, mindful of the division in the ranks of the Republicans. And so, in a sense, we wanted, A, to give them a forum to work out what model they actually did want to propose, but it had the added beneficial effect of exposing the divisions in the Republican ranks. And that is still their problem. They really don't know what model of republic they want. But I'm a believer in the parliamentary process. For example, I think it was idiotic for the coalition to have a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. If you're going to deal with that, it should have just been dealt with in the parliament. Whether you like it or not, the process by which we change our constitution is by way of the federal parliament, coming together to agree on legislation to amend it and putting that legislation to the people. So, for example, I think the most obvious amendment that should be made to the Constitution is to raise the retirement age for judges. 70 is idiotic, I think you could probably get a parliamentary majority through both houses to support a referendum to increase the retirement age, let's say, to 75. You wouldn't need a convention or anything like that, plebiscites, etc., for that sort of change. So I think while I think the Constitutional Convention was a great way to deal with the Republican issue, I think it's horses for courses how you deal with other proposed changes. The worst possible approach is the plebiscite. As I said, I think it was wrong in the case of same-sex marriage, and I think it's a disastrous, cynical, manipulative approach that the Labor Party has now committed to in relation to the question of becoming a republic, and Alistair spoke well at our Samuel Griffith Society on that, and I look forward to his address this afternoon. But that is the worst of all possible ways of attempting to manipulate the population into effecting change.
You mentioned the referendum which was passed for judges to retire at the age of 70, which I agree with you, it's ridiculous, but there was no case. And the reason there was no case was no member of the Parliament voted against it. Yeah. What does that tell us?
Well, my recollection, it was on the back of McTiernan, yes, wasn't it, being there till he was 98. And so, and I guess back then when it happened, people didn't live quite as long as they do now. And 70, the retirement age was 65, so people thought, oh, well, we'll let the judges stay an extra 5 years. And you're right, there was no opposition. But now we've seen the evidence of highly qualified, intelligent, capable judges being forced to leave the bench at 70 when they're in their prime. And it is ridiculous.
So you're not against people of my age dribbling?
When you start dribbling, it might be a problem.
It's been said by Professor Williams that the reason why the direct elect model didn't come up was because of the appointed members. But my reading of going through all the rounds is that each time a model was rejected, including the direct elect models, the majority of elected Republican delegates voted against the direct elect model. Is that your understanding?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the ARM, won the plurality of seats at the convention. The Labor Party had a very strong commitment to the Keating-Turnbull model of a parliamentary appointment of a president. Direct electionists weren't well represented at the convention. So it seemed to us early on that the model that would emerge was going to be the Keating-Turnbull model for a parliamentary appointment of a president. And that's the way it turned out. And just to come to the point you've been making before about attempts to persuade the ACM to get behind the McGarvey model, I remember one of the funny quirks of the Constitutional Convention was we sensibly appointed Ian Sinclair and Barry Jones to chair it, even though both are Republicans, but I think they did a great job chairing it. But I had a huge row with Sinclair over where we were going to have it. He wanted to have it in the Great Hall of the new Parliament, and I insisted on it being in the House of Reps in the old Parliament. And we had to go and take that dispute to John Howard, who fortunately sided with me. And I think it was wonderful to have had it in the old Parliament. But I remember it was great for John because he set up his office in the old Prime Minister's office in Old Parliament House, and he loved being in there because he'd never had a chance to be Prime Minister in that office. And I remember he and I had this huge blue with Tony Abbott, who had this crazy idea that we should persuade the ACM to back the McGarvey model, to sort of have a least worst model. And unfortunately, we bullied Tony out of that, and the ACM, to its great credit, stuck to its guns, as Lloyd said, and didn't vote for any of the models. And so as we always anticipated, the Turnbull-Keating model emerged, and John, even though it didn't get a majority, got a plurality, and that was very sensibly the model which we agreed we'd take to a referendum.
Well, you'll be delighted to know if you watch one of those videos, and you can put up with my questioning, Tony Abbott now thinks that we were right.
He's seen the light.
Yes, he's seen the light.
He was under the influence of Pearson, I think, at the time.
Yeah. Now, where did the question come from? Did John Howard rig the question?
Yeah, when you say the question, I mean, yeah, when the referendum is put to the people, there has to be a description of the legislation that the Parliament has passed to effect the change to the Constitution, and there will always be an argument about how exactly you describe that particular legislation. And what we ended up with was a compromise, I guess. The Republicans peculiarly were upset that there was reference in the question to the President being appointed by a two-thirds vote of the Parliament. They didn't seem to like that, even though that was their model. We constitutional conservatives were disappointed that the question did not include reference to the method of dismissal of a president, which was an outrageous methodology, and I think did come to harm the Republican cause quite considerably. But so inevitably the question was a compromise. It can't be too long. It has to summarise the question that is being put. So it certainly wasn't rigged, and there was compromise certainly on the part of we constitutional conservatives in the government as to the nature of the question.
When the bill was being examined by the Joint Committee, they met in this building. Kerry Jones and David Elliott and I were coming to the building, and we saw Malcolm Turnbull coming out looking very worried, being pursued by journalists, and he didn't look at all happy. And we got in. We were proposing, I remember I did the draft, we proposed that the question also include the dismissal. That we wanted it to say, and that the President can be dismissed by the Prime Minister without notice, without grounds, and without any right of appeal. The committee strangely rejected that. But
that was a big ask.
Later on we realised what Malcolm Turnbull had been proposing. He wanted two words to be removed. He wanted President changed to Head of State, and he wanted the other word he wanted out of the question was Republic. And even the Republican press ridiculed him. It went on for 3 days and he withdrew it. Obviously, his focus groups had been telling him republics are on the nose. Don't mention republic. One of the features of the campaign was the hookup, the engine room, every morning at 7, and Fung Van from Kerry's office called it Central Command. And 3 ministers joined. There was a hookup across Australia for ACM, but 3 ministers from time to time came into that. And you were one of them with Alexander Downer and Tony Abbott. John Howard never did because he wanted to be above the fray, I think, and to show that he was not campaigning, but he did say to people how he would vote. How do you think that worked, that engine room approach?
Well, it worked extremely well.
Since I was chairing it.
How can I say anything else? No, look, it was modelled on the way the Liberal Party runs election campaigns. And I've been a full-time campaigner from 1977 on as a Deputy Federal Director of the Liberal Party, State Director in South Australia, and I travelled as John Howard's parliamentary advisor in the 96 campaign. So it was critical that the ACM and the No Committee run the No case in 1999 exactly the way professional campaigns are run. And they always involve that very early morning call and setting a direction for the day, agreeing on the key messages, dealing with the any attacks that were coming from us that needed neutralising or destroying. So it was a terrific process. As I say, it worked extremely professionally. And I must say, as an old campaigner, I was amazed at how terrible the Republican campaign was. It was, Malcolm and Greg Barnes, couldn't run a campaign to save themselves. I knew Greg Barnes. He was the Chief of Staff to John Fay. But they really, I was staggered by how bad a campaign they ran. But we couldn't, get carried away with that. We had a tough campaign to run ourselves, but it was extremely well run by Kerry and you, and it was a privilege to be part of that process.
One of the measures you took was to give equal funding to the yes and no cases, and you decided, I thought it was a very clever decision, you decided to award seats on the yes and no committees on the basis of the votes won in the campaign for the election of the convention. That resulted in the no case of ACM having 8 seats and 2 real Republicans. That was Clem Jones, the former Lord Mayor of Brisbane, and Ted Mack. Ted Mack,
Cleary not on it?
No, he only had 2. He was around, helped, but not on the committee. And I remember John Singleton, who was the advertising executive for either the Yes case or for the ARM. I think he was building a new house with a new wife at the time, so he needed a lot of money. And he charged a lot, which is worth much. He charged much more than the ACM and the Vote No people charged. But he said to me afterwards, he said, I thought that would be the breakdown for the No case, because I didn't think that those 2 Republicans would work with you. But it worked very well, it worked very smoothly and professionally. But was that your design, that idea of having equal funding and allocating seats on the basis of electoral performance?
Well, there had to be official yes and no campaigns. It was in the government's behest. How else were we going to allocate positions on those committees other than by reference back to that convention election? I don't know how else you'd do it. And it was certainly our very strong view that there had to be equal funding. I just had the displeasure of rereading Malcolm Turnbull's book on the whole Republic and Convention exercise, which is a very painful thing to do. But I recall he complained bitterly in his book about the fact that the No case should be funded. I think it was a very important principle that each case, official yes and no cases, receive public funding. And, by 1999 there was public funding of elections around Australia in many cases. And there wasn't any real objection from any quarters other than the ARM, who thought, it was terrible to give the No case $7.5 million, whatever it was. But I think it was met with acceptance, that was a fair and proper way to approach it, and there was very strict governance of the way that money was to be spent on behalf of taxpayers, and I think it was a great model. And it's interesting, you look at that Gillard's proposed local government referendum, to which I was bitterly opposed, and the worst thing the Abbott opposition did was initially agree to support that referendum. I couldn't believe it. And Peter Ruth and I formed our own no campaign committee on that. But the thing that brought that unstuck was that Gillard refused to agree to equal funding for both sides. And so we fomented a rebellion within the Liberal Party on that basis against it, and the opposition finally changed its position. So I think that principle has now been well established, that you've got to give equal funding to both sides.
Was that local government no committee we were both on?
Yep. It was a good operation, that
Yes.
one too. And I think we'd have won that if she'd gone to a referendum.
Oh, they were so frightened by our presence that they called it off. Lord Deeds, who was a distinguished soldier and editor of the London Daily Telegraph, had been a minister in the Hume government, said 2 days after the referendum, "I've rarely attended elections in any country, certainly not a democratic one, in which the newspapers have displayed more shameless bias. One and all, they determined that Australians should have a republic, and they used every device towards that end." Is that your impression?
The media were incredibly biased, but it was to be anticipated. I mean, you've got to deal with the turf you got and the cards you dealt. And, we knew the media would run very heavily in favour of the public, which meant, as you were saying before, you got to get over their heads and appeal directly to the people. But refreshingly, in a way, gratefully, the fact that all the media were in favour of this republic and the majority of people in all the states said to hell with you was it just showed you how uninfluential the media are at the end of the day. And I think that backfired on the Republicans. People didn't like being lectured to by journalists and the Rupert Murdochs and others about how they should vote on this. So I think it actually played into our hands and backfired on the Republicans.
The No case won nationally. They won in every state. People mention the ACT, but that's not relevant. They won in every state. Not in the Constitution.
That's right.
And in 72% of electorates. Was that the result you expected?
Look, I was confident of defeating it because as a senator for the second smallest state, I was always quietly confident that at least the 4 smaller states would say no by election day. I wasn't sure about New South Wales and Victoria or the overall popular vote, but I was very confident that there'd be a no vote in the 4 smaller states. What was spectacular for me was getting a no vote in Victoria, the most socialist state and left-wing state in this union, which for my sins I'm now a resident of, and enrolled in the seat of Melbourne, believe it or not, Adam Band's seat. But one of the best things, if I may say with all due humility, one of the things I did achieve was persuading you guys that a fellow called Rick Brown should be the campaign director in Victoria. Because I knew Rick has a DLP background and a trade union background and a passionate constitutional conservative and a terrific organiser. And I thought if anyone can get a no vote in Victoria, it's Rick. And Rick was the one who basically devised the slogan, "Say no to the politician's republic," and convinced us all that that's what we had to run with. And it was an incredibly powerful slogan. And it was extraordinary feat that Rick achieved in Victoria to get Victoria of all states to vote no. So while I was always confident we could defeat this thing, to get all 6 states and the popular vote was fantastic.
I was very impressed with Rick Brown, and I didn't know that you were the cause of his coming in. He did have a DLP background. I believe he has been working on free trade agreements and demonstrating that they don't work as well as they should.
Yeah, Rick runs a political consultancy in Melbourne, and that'll be one of his causes.
Now, this question has been the subject of 12 major votes and inquiries all taxpayer funded, all totally taxpayer funded except one, and that was the Corowa Conference. And I think it was insulting to call it the Corowa Conference. It was partially funded by the taxpayer. Isn't it about time that something happened? Because I think it and the Indigenous recognition issue are cluttering up the constitutional reform agenda, and they're really surely bigger issues which should be dealt with by the nation.
Well, look, I don't think the Republican issue will ever go away. We've got to accept that, and that's why the continued existence and vitality of the ACM is critically important, because you do have to be ready to deal with this issue. The Republicans have parked it while Queen Elizabeth is on the throne. They've recognised they've got absolutely no hope while the Queen remains on the throne. They think, I regard as quite stupidly, that once the Queen is gone and the crown passes to Charles, that'll be their big moment. And should there be a federal Labor government then or any time soon after, they will strike. They genuinely believe that is their moment, and Fitzsimons and others and Turnbull all make that point. They quite openly act as ghouls just waiting for the Queen's demise. It's disgusting in my view, but I think underestimates the opposition to their cause. It underestimates the fact that what we're talking about is the institution of the crown, not the personality of the person wearing the throne, the crown. While Charles is a bit quirky, I actually think he might be a very good king, yes. In fact, and Camilla will be by his side, and I have great regard for her. And of course that brings Kate and William one step closer, and I think that will prove to be very popular. But in any event, this is not about, the royals per se. It's about the institution of the crown, and that's what we have to defend. And the Republicans, as and when they come back at us, still have this issue of what model are they going to back. I suspect they will probably go for the direct election model. That is the one that, if you run opinion polls, comes out ahead, and they will, I think, naively think that is the one they can get over the line. I actually think, as an old campaigner, it'll be easier to defeat the direct election model than the two-thirds parliamentary model, because it is such a revolutionary change to our system of government to have a directly elected president that it will be easier to attack and expose than any other model. While it would be better if we could just, as you say, move on, I don't think, while we still have Irishmen in our country, what is it about the Irish, I tell you? The issue will ever be there. And as I say, the Queen, what is she, 93? So I hope the coalition can remain in office for some time to come, but we must accept that, one day there will be another Labor government, and there will be a King Charles, and that will be the moment when we have to face up again to the barricades.
The Republicans used to advance many reasons for becoming a republic. It would improve trade, it would increase immigration, was the position of one member of the New South Wales Parliament. The French would understand our constitution. The Indonesians would understand it. Eventually it became more and more ridiculous until finally they retreated to one position, that only in a republic can we have an Australian as head of state, notwithstanding the fact that whenever governors-general are sent overseas, the government always describes the Governor-General, tells other governments that the Governor-General goes as the head of state. What advice would you give to us in relation to... We've always argued that the Governor-General is the Australian head of state. Do you think... I think it's correct legally and constitutionally, because it's not in the Constitution, but what advice would you give to us on that matter?
Yeah, it does show you how shallow the Republican cause is, that the only argument they have that gives them any traction whatsoever is to put this false proposition that we don't have an Australian head of state. We have had an Australian head of state since Isaac Isaacs. That person is the Governor-General. The Governor-General is the head of state in all practical and legal and constitutional terms. And the constitutional conservatives must never relent from arguing that case. It disappoints me that some other constitutional monarchists don't accept that argument. It's the major problem with the AML that they, some of them don't accept this proposition. You must be absolutely clear and unequivocal that the Queen is the sovereign and the Governor-General is the head of state. And the Governor-General is and always will be an Australian. There is no way on earth in which any future government is going to appoint anyone other than an Australian as the Governor-General, and must never relent from that, because it is the only argument that the Republicans are left with. So it must be confronted and dealt with. And every time I've failed myself. The other morning I saw, because I wasn't, the Sky News presenter on the Sky, of all things, the female co-presenter in the morning referred to the Queen as our head of state. So all of you, whenever that sort of thing happens, have got to respond and call it out, because we just cannot allow that proposition to go anywhere. So it will be the only argument they have next time as well, and it is the only argument they get any traction with, so you've got to be relentless in arguing against it.
Just on that, just as a comment, I watch opinion polls just to see how wrong they are. And Essential runs a poll every so often on the Republic. They were commissioned by the ARM to run a poll, and the ARM had a different question, which included head of state. Are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic with an Australian head of state? Ever since then, in their general poll, they've added those words, Australia's head of state. In other words, they are weighting the question. I wrote to them about it and they ignored me. It is worth, I think, 8%. I remember I tried to tell that group that met at Tony's office, and one of them completely misunderstood. It's a difference between 43% and 51%.
Absolutely.
We have to tell royalists, ultra-royalists who just can't bear the thought of the Queen not being referred to as head of state, as if they know what a head of state is, as if Australians are lying awake at night wondering who the head of state is. I mean, it wasn't even in the Macquarie Dictionary when the Republicans hit on it as the only argument they had.
Yeah.
We have to persuade all of our allies and friends that the Governor-General is the head of state. Ken Handley, who's a brilliant lawyer, such a good judge, he's been asked to be a judge in 3 or 4 different countries, has demonstrated this. Sir David Smith has demonstrated this. It will be in a session today. We have to persuade those other constitutional monarchists, ultra-royalists, that they're wrong on this point, and it would be a serious error to let that get out just for some silly reason. We have to maintain ranks on that. And on that point, I would like to thank you not only for coming today, but for being that Special Minister of State, for devising that Howard Minchin process, which I think is a superb template, right through to the referendum for future major constitutional issues, because it is so fair, it is so just and so proper. So, and I must say, I was disappointed when you decided to leave politics, but you obviously had your own issues and so on. I'm sure you did very well in the United States, and it's wonderful to see you here among us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.